Hi, everybody. Good morning. Happy Monday. I'm super excited for this Data is Love with my friend Kyra that I had the pleasure of meeting three and a half years ago now in the before times at an event that was packed. And so this is going to be a really good conversation, lots of real talk about empathy and leadership. And I want to just jump in and introduce Kyra. And I'm wondering, Kyra, if you'll just start us off with telling us how you got here, right? Like, what has your journey been to this moment when you're thinking a lot about the intersection of empathy and leadership?
Yeah, absolutely. I enjoyed receiving this question from you because it required some reflection, and I had to think back to the most pivotal moment in my career that really connected leadership and empathy and the type of change work that I obsess over today, including that impact. And the first thing that really comes to mind is when I was a trained facilitator in the National Coalition Building Institute. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that. It's short referenced as NCBI. It's an international organization, but national is in the title. And in this role, my job wasn't only to educate people around issues of race, sexuality, identity, but it was also to help individuals build skills that would move their communities through healing and into action, like true solidarity. And I did this work across communities of color. I did it in very intense environments as well, like with police officers and people of the community, our neighbors without homes and small business owners downtown, international student populations and domestic student populations. And in terms of this moment right here, you're meeting me years after I left that role. I had been a full-time activist, small business owner. I had my own startup. I joined a well-known social media tech company here in Austin. I've been unemployed. I'm now a consultant. And I survived and led through movements such as Black Lives Matter Squared, okay, both, and Stop Asian Hate, and the massive loss of life and ways of living as a result of a COVID pandemic. And what you'll find is today, I've not only used those skills throughout all of that, also I've invested in them and honed them to really create the version of the world that I think we all deserve to live in. And my goal is to, right now in this moment, is to take what I've learned, what I've applied and see it work, and pass that along to as many leaders as I can.
I love that. I also love having, in part, people on Data is Love because regardless of how long I've known somebody, they'll always share a little snippet about their life that I never knew before. And I'm also discovering like so many of our past lives in movement spaces. So many of us have like done that work in our like teens and 20s, and have lived that life as activists that we get to bring into our, now corporate lives and corporate careers. Yeah. Okay. So, as we've been talking about this session and planning for it, I shared with you that I've been thinking about empathy in the same ways that I think about data literacy, right? Which is it's an absolutely core skill for all leaders. And really all people, because what we're noticing, especially in the last couple of years, is that leaders are making decisions that have huge impacts on lives of people, based on gut instincts or based on their lived experiences. And I don't have to beat the drum that leaders rarely look like the rest of their organizations, right? Like they tend to be a pretty homogenous group. The second thing that I've been thinking about, the connection between empathy and data literacy is that it's a little bit in the eye of the beholder, right? Who you are and the identities that you have impacts how you look at a data set. And I think it's similar with respect to empathy, like how do we step into someone else's shoes when we have so little idea of who they are. And I'm just curious, like, what more would you add? What do you think of this connection? Because you're deep into the empathy lane, and I'm deep in the data literacy lane.
Absolutely. Yeah. And how our worlds come together. I think that's a beautiful link, because it does create the understanding that I think most of us need to have, especially in leadership. Our experience and our lens alone will only get us so far.
Yeah.
Uh, and so I certainly see that connection, especially when we're talking about the type of empathy most of us are aware of, and reference most often, and that's emotional empathy. If there's any empaths in the room, you know this type of empathy very well. Very well. It's the type where you feel what others feel, in theory. Okay.
Hmm.
For those of us who aren't natural empaths, it's more about the effort to feel what a person is going through, right? You said
Yeah.
the quote of like, put yourself in someone else's shoes, right? However, in leadership specifically, the type of leadership or the type of empathy I think we need to focus on is more of a cognitive empathy. Um, and for the exact reasons that you've already pointed out, if you're in a position of power, okay, and you are trying to feel what others are feeling, the likelihood that you're going to accurately assume what they're feeling is very slim, especially what you've already shared about identities of the organization versus those in leadership. But also, it's probably gravely understated. And then I guess what I would like to tell people is, yes, your own experiences, your own life circumstances can help you create understanding, right? We like
Hmm.
meaning through relating. However, we just need to be mindful that it creates bias, assumptions, and the centering of self when it's not about you. And that's the key, I think, to understanding cognitive empathy in the workplace, and how in positions of power, we have to use a different type of empathy to actually bring about a solution for those you lead and your organizational goals.
I love it. I'm taking notes also. Okay, so the word cognitive empathy is totally new for me. And I also heard you say centering of self when it's not about you. And I just have to tell you this like kind of funny but cringy story. So last summer, right? We're out here in the Pacific Northwest, and there have been like insane forest fires happening up and down the West Coast like every summer.
Mhm.
And there's a leader that I have been working with for a long time. And at one point, we're like, wow, this is really scary, right? Like these fires. And she says to me, she's like, I know, like I'm also a climate refugee. As she's like in her $20 million house in like Montana, right? That she's like fled to because the air quality in the Portland area is kind of mucky, right? And so I think it was a move on her part to be empathic. I think it was a move
Yes.
on her part to be empathic, right? Where she's like, I get it, right? Like, I get it. Will you say more about like what exactly is cognitive empathy? And you started to do this already, where you're like sort of teasing apart emotional empathy. But what are the other differences?
Yeah. So I'm still recovering from hearing what you just shared.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. And to be honest, I think folks in here have said things that they later look back on and go, who should not have, not the time or the place. And so I hope to talk a little bit about that later on and how we can avoid that ahead of time. So
Yeah.
excited to share those tips with folks later on, because we understand it's coming from a place, but impact was totally different. And to answer your question, cognitive empathy in the DEI space for DEI practitioners, in case there are any on the call, you may have heard it referred to as perspective taking. And this type of empathy is also called empathic accuracy. Okay, so as we start to like think about like what's the difference, I want us to hold on to that word accuracy, okay? And perspective taking. It involves having a more complete and accurate knowledge about the contents of another person's mind, experience, and feelings. Okay, this is about accuracy. And you know how you're going to get that information? It's going to come from the people you were supporting and leading. It is not about you guessing how someone might feel or assuming with all of your identities and experience, just purely being in their shoes are going to be able to grasp a hold of, right? And so when you think of cognitive empathy and its place specifically in the workplace, it's all about listening specifically to the needs of the people that you're supporting. And I, like, is that helpful? Is that getting to clarity?
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
and this is again where I feel like there's such a big overlap in what it means to lead with empathy and also just like really good practices around collecting data. Because data is that window into what's happening for people inside of your organizations, right? I often tell my clients that no one is a mind reader. And then, of course, there's one person in the room that's like, I read tarot cards. And I'm like, great. Like you could be highly intuitive, but also like no one's a mind reader. And so we need to actually ask people what's happening for them, how they need to be supported. Um, because we live in a world that's so deeply segregated, right? There's one stat that I think comes up every like MLK Day, and it'll like come out of Juneteenth, and it's always like 75% of white Americans don't have any friends of color, and then there's like an asterisk, and then you read that, and what the stat is that it's not that white folks don't know people of color. It's that most white folks don't have bonded relationships with people of color, in particular, Black and Native folks, right? Like they don't have a really good friend. And so, where we pick up a lot of what's happening for someone is in those bonded relationships, right? That's not happening for a lot of white folks. So, yeah, listening to the needs of people becomes even more important and much more of a priority. So you're not guessing. I want to shift gears a little bit to micro inclusion. We know there is something called microaggression, and there's a lot of trainings. I'm sure you've seen it as well the last couple of years. It's like about training on microaggressions, right? But you're flipping that. You're saying, okay, whatever, like let's talk about inclusion specifically. So will you say more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think first I'd like to not acknowledge that while I am a huge advocate for micro inclusions, this language was supplied to me for something that I do and practice and instruct. I should look into where that actually stems from because it's not mine. That language is not mine from a place of my own creation. However, the practice of micro inclusions is a practice I love talking about because one, I think it's important to preface this first with by no means am I an advocate of incrementalism at all when it comes to justice, when it comes to equity. And what I mean by that, actually, if there's any activists in this space, I'm going to say a chant, and I'm just curious if y'all know it. So it starts off, what do we want? I'm going to pause. Wait, what was that?
Is it justice? Is it change?
Justice.
It's
When do
we
we
want justice right now. We want it
right
right
now?
now.
Right. So when we think about micro inclusion and incrementalism,
Hmm.
it's not an advocacy of incrementalism. Justice
Hmm.
now.
Yeah.
And when folks are trying to wrap your head around incrementalism, I just like for folks to think about have you ever been in a room where people are patting themselves on the back for making the same decision or just slightly different than what they've normally made in the past, and then say,
Hmm.
hey, progress. But there has been no positive impact to the community they set out to supposedly help. Right? That's incrementalism.
Mm.
just a little. And now we're going to go, yay, progress. Like, don't be upset. We moved the needle a little bit. Absolutely not. Okay. But there is a space for micro inclusions. And that space, I like to think of it as a thread in fabric. Okay, so to get a piece of fabric, you need a bunch of threads. To me, micro inclusions are the thread to make that fabric. Okay, so you need lots of it for the impact, and we call it micro inclusion because the effort to do the work is so little. It's so small. Okay. But the impact is grand. So let's not get confused with the word micro. And the same thing goes for microaggressions, right? We think of it, oh, it was just one little phrase I said, but the impact over time, especially, is there, and it's painful, and it has damaging effects, possibly for a lifetime. So
Yeah.
let's not confuse the amount of effort with the actual impact. And now to get into the actual practice, because micro inclusions create culture over time and with repetition. I like to tell folks a good place to practice, if empathy isn't your cognitive empathy isn't like a natural skill to you, a great place to start is micro inclusions. What I mean by that is, what are small things that you can do that create a more inclusive environment for someone to be able to access their full potential and be present. This is helpful for the organization's goals as well, right? So,
Yeah.
great, easy example is, when you introduce yourself, you include your pronouns of reference. Not necessarily charging everyone in this space to do that, because that could create a very uncomfortable situation for some folks. Okay. But what
Hmm.
is it like to, as a leader, to own that you understand that there is not purely a binary when it comes to gender identity and expression, and that we want to create a space where people can own that identity and share that with their colleagues. Okay. You are modeling that behavior. That is a micro inclusion. If ahead of a mandatory training, you check religious calendars, it's practice. You do it every single time, right? Before you have a huge meeting where you're expecting everyone to be there. If you have a diverse organization, some folks may prefer to be with their families and use that PTO time, especially in a country that doesn't acknowledge, all of the religious holidays. Like, that's takes you 2 seconds to Google it. But the impact is huge. People will remember, thank you for not having that during Ramadan. Okay, that impact goes on. And in the same regard, when you make a habit of having micro inclusions as part of your practice, not only do people recognize that, but they extend empathy and understanding to you as a person in leadership, because leadership oppression is a real thing. To be a leader, it takes courage, and you will mess it up. To be in relationship with folks where you've understood their life circumstances and where they are in their journey, and have shown that and demonstrated that time and time again. When it comes to be your time to be in a place of learning and have to listen, people react differently to members of their community needing some additional support and realignment.
Leadership takes courage and you'll mess it up. I'm just sitting with that because I think that so often, especially when it comes to race equity work or gender equity work, there's almost this desire for people to have a checklist of exactly the right things to say and do, and not a lot of bandwidth for experimenting and like finding your own purpose in that, right? And moving through that on your own terms. Um, okay, speaking of leaders, lots of research linking leadership and empathy and organizational development, right? I think that we're at this moment where for DEI, for empathy, for lots of things, there will be some like wild stat that'll be like, in organizations where leaders are empathic, profitability increases by 30-fold, and you're like, who's studying this? Where does this come from? But what's your experience, right? What's your experience with this link, and what is the data around it? It's probably not 30x, right?
Yeah, definitely not. At least I haven't read that. I will. So, to connect the point you made prior to jumping into this new question, is the experimentation around sometimes leadership and doing DEI work. So
Mm-hmm.
part of my description in bio, if folks have taken a look at that, I call myself a social innovation strategist and consultant. And the reason being is because I believe truly, especially in tech, that the new framework for diversity, equity, and inclusion that moves us into the progress we need to see to date uh, revolves around a reframe. And we have to think about coming up with solutions for our organizations or to these societal level issues, systemic issues, historical issues, and impact from a place of innovation. And when we do that, we understand in business that innovation needs to be resourced. We
Yeah.
understand that we need people around the table who look and come from different places. Okay. We think about
Mm-hmm.
innovation. We know we're going to get it wrong sometimes. There is permission to fail. There's not an encouragement. We're not asking everyone to fail, right? But we understand
Yeah.
happen, and in that moment is where we learn. And so I love talking about that. We'll definitely have to get into that at another point in great detail. Definitely working on a few case studies I'd be happy to share with your team. Um, but connecting innovation specifically to empathy is also something that gets me excited. And so when people reported their leaders were empathetic, they were more likely to report that they were able to be innovative, come up with new ideas, think creatively around solving problems. 61% of employees compared to only 13% of their employees with less empathetic leaders, right? And so that's no small jump when it relates to innovation. In terms of percentage points. And then a little bit about inclusivity that makes me really happy. I guess I should preface this and say empathy and leadership, to find that a little bit. An empathetic leader is a leader who demonstrates care, concern, and understanding for employees' life circumstances. And the word demonstrates is very powerful here because it has to be seen. There has to be evidence of it. It's not purely about feeling, okay? Your team has to witness it, what that concern looks like, and it has to feel like concern and care to them. And so when you have that, empathy and leadership is a strategy for reducing burnout, cultivating inclusion, and as I mentioned, increasing innovation. It's also a retention strategy. I mean, 57% of white women and 62% of women of color said they were unlikely to think of leaving their companies when they felt their life circumstances were respected and valued by their companies.
That's so powerful.
Yeah, and when you look at the comparison, when they didn't feel that level of value or respect for their life circumstances, only 14% and 30% of white women and women of color, respectively, said they were unlikely to consider leaving. Again, not a small jump. So those are some of the data points. And I know you send like an email afterwards, and so we can definitely, I've been
Yeah.
following data is love. I know the drill. But the takeaway here is empathetic leadership throughout the organization is a strategy against some of the biggest problems we're facing in every major organization today.
Yeah. Yeah. I I'm still sitting with what you said just a couple of minutes ago. You said innovation needs to be resourced, right? It doesn't happen in a vacuum.
Absolutely.
And what about resourcing ourselves?
Mm,
What about resourcing ourselves if you're a highly empathic leader?
yes. Okay. So let's honor this moment right now. We can't talk about empathy at work with others without talking about cognitive empathy for self and our treatment of ourselves. Uh,
Mm,
if we could all think about the last time life happened and it had an impact you weren't proud of, it was hard to understand, what emotions come up? What was your internal dialogue like? I know for me, recently, months ago, as a very empathetic leader, got incredibly burnt out. Was extending myself to support the needs of people I truly cared about, at a cost, because I didn't know how to turn that same care back towards myself. And I'm talking beyond, you know, booking a massage or having a bubble bath, which are all great things. Do that. Skincare, yes. And also, um, did you stop and ask yourself what your needs were, or did you punish yourself for not having the energy to show up anymore? Like, what did that voice sound like? Was it the same voice that you would extend to a friend going through that, or was it more critical? For me, that voice was not nice. And I put this expectation on myself that I had to be all of those things for everyone else, and I came last. And I'm surprised I survived, because someone like me was doing way too much. And so, um, if you can all, like, just assess that voice in your head and remember that cognitive empathy is asking about needs accurately. What are your needs? Show up for yourself that same way. Okay. And even more so, you know, in my church, there's a woman, and I think a lot of communities of color know this phrase, especially. Actually, it's been popularized quite a bit. You know, on social media, they love all those positive quotes, but essentially, they do. It's everywhere. You know,
Yeah.
you can't pour from an empty cup.
Mm-hmm.
And so, thinking about the ways in which that you are going to be able to create abundance for others by just taking a moment and checking the levels of your own cup, and then filling them if that's what they need, if that's what you need.
Mm. I I feel like I can feel my like this like choky crying feelings coming on. And if anybody knows me, they know I hate public displays of emotion. I just really hate them. Um, and as a definitely a person who's in the self-punishment camp, I am that person. I feel really guilty. I feel really guilty when I'm burnt out, which only makes me more burnt out. And it just keeps me locked in this kind of vicious cycle. And it's, yeah, okay, checking in with ourselves. It's a practice that we need to work on. Um, I want to switch gears to maybe a little tactical as we start to close out. This time goes by really fast, and I feel like we can just be having these conversations, you know, for like hours, right? And before, you know, before I ask you to share just some tactical things, here's something that I want to acknowledge. It's AAPI Heritage Month, right? Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And as an Asian person, I'm from India. Um, we don't hold a lot of empathy for Black communities, for Native communities. You know, there's such deep xenophobia, and um, so part of my work in the last couple of years has been really confronting my own anti-Blackness.
Mm.
There are no degrees that make a difference, right? Like you have to do that work on your own. So I'm sharing that because I know that there are people listening that probably think of themselves as some like ninja empathy master, and you're probably not. You're probably not. There are like these really deeply held biases that we have that make us a little bit less empathic to certain groups of people. So we got to do better. And that said, the floor is yours. Tell us how we do better.
Oh, um, thank you, Aparna, for the work, for the vulnerability, for sharing your story, and for seeking connection authentic connection with the community that I feel a part of. And I love this question and how you prefaced it, especially honoring the Heritage Month that we're currently in right now. What a lot of folks don't know about me, probably on this call, back to your first point earlier, is that I have spent a great deal of time being pained by, learning from, loving on the challenge of the Asian and Black community solidarity. It's work I've been committed to for most of my adult life, and find this month to be a very important month for me to show up and story share. So about the relationships and the communities I've been able to help build. So grateful for this time and to be holding space during this time, especially with you. And then tips. Let's kick this off with what I call my green lights for outreach. I'm excited to share this with all of you before we hop off. Essentially, one of the best ways to practice empathy in a position of power is knowing what's going on with your team and then reaching out if the situation calls for it. Examples, just because I've brought these up before, the death of George Floyd, Stop Asian Hate movement, when things like this are going on and you want to check in with a colleague, right? Maybe a direct report. Here are 3 things that I want you to think about before you reach out to that colleague. I use this. I have friends who use this. If you have feedback, please let me know. Things to add. I'm an open book. We'll share my contact information. Green light number 1 is I am not reaching out to soothe my own shame, my own ignorance, or desire for an awareness cookie. What's an awareness cookie? That's when you want a pat on your back for being woke. You want cookies for being perceived, because you know what's going on in the news. If that's what's going on, and I'm saying it kind of jokingly, but it happens to all of us. We're like,
all the time.
Yeah, we want to show people that we know this is going on. And
yeah.
Red light, pause. That doesn't mean you can't reach out later. It means you need to hold on and give your own self your own awareness cookie and do the work. 2 is I have knowledge that they have been impacted by this event, or that they usually pay close attention to this community or type of news. Here's why. During the workday, it is not your job to interrupt somebody's workflow to share bad news, especially if you're not super knowledgeable on the topic. So I am not going to go run to a colleague and say, oh, did you hear this happened? I'm so sorry. How are you feeling? Pause. But if you think that they might be aware and or pay attention to this type of news, it's a green light. Okay, it's an okay thing to reach out. Or if the news gets so big, it's hard to avoid what was going on with the 2 movements that I shared previously. Okay, and the 3rd green light is I have a semi-close relationship with this person, or I see or work with this person every day. Here's why. Usually this check-in communication is coming through written. And when you don't have a semi-close relationship with someone and or don't communicate with them often, they might be in a moment of crises dealing with this news. And for you to reach out and y'all don't communicate very often, it may put them in a position to try and read through the lines. And they may be wondering, does this person really care? Or wait, who is this person? And are they mocking me? It could go every which way. So if you communicate often, that eliminates the possibility that you are stressing that person out with your outreach. It's not a requirement necessarily, but it is important when you're going to do direct outreach to someone who is that's especially doesn't hold the same level of power that you do. So let's not stress folks out, especially during a time of crisis. And so these are 3 green lights I like to share with folks to think about before you do that outreach. You can always pick up a phone. That's definitely a possibility. I know, Aparna, you share that with me, a story about that in the past. I know over time, I usually give a couple of points in terms of what your outreach should have, but we'll have to save that for the next time because I think we're 5 minutes over.
It's
Ah,
okay. It's totally okay. Go ahead and share them. Go ahead and share them.
okay.
Yeah. What are
Yeah,
a
is that
couple of tips for our
yay?
outreach?
So when you're crafting your outreach, remember always your focus should be removing burdens. So if anything you say
Mm,
placing burden or an expectation on that person, scratch it. Okay, this looks like not expecting a response. So if you're typing something out, go ahead and say, it's okay, you don't have to respond to this, or I'm not expecting a response. That removes the burden of them having to come up with, thank you so much. Like, it's not about them showing gratitude for you being knowledgeable or caring, right? So go ahead and let them know that you're not expecting a response and or remove that expectation yourself, okay? Uh,
mm-hmm,
being brief and sincere.
mm,
When someone's going through a lot, um, especially if you're not super close, reading a letter from a somewhat stranger or a coworker, you're doing too much. That's placing a burden on them to get through it. Keep it brief, but be sincere. The third thing that I really like to share, and it relates to removing burden, is so many of us are conditioned to say, let me know if there's anything I can do for you. Where's the burden when I say that? Whose job is it then? Did I just make that? Okay. When someone is going through something, especially in that moment, to ask them to come up with a way in which you can be supportive in that moment is difficult. I don't want us to shy away from the question of like asking about what people's needs are in an open ended. Absolutely, you can do that. In this moment, right, when we're talking about crises or an event like the ones mentioned previously, it's not the place. Think of something you can offer, make it a yes or no. And if they want something else, they can definitely create the space for that. But, hey, here's a Dash Door gift card, Dash Door, DoorDash. What is that called? I'm not promoting any businesses up here, but one of them little food things. Here's a gift card, get dinner tonight on me, right? Or
mm-hmm,
I experienced a freeze in Austin a couple of years ago, and folks were like, "Oh no, we're heard about the freeze, Kyra. Like, are you okay? Slash, is there anything I can do?" How do I tell people that I don't have a place to shower? Like, what do I look like asking a colleague, can I come over and shower? But that most of
mm-hmm.
the city is without water. Say I have a place to shower if you need it, right? So like get specific to remove the burden. And those are just the tips really quickly.
Oh my God. As I'm listening to you talk about these tips, I'm like, also, this works in times of grief and loss.
Yes.
Also it works when there's something super traumatic that's happened in our world, right? I think the application is really broad.
Agree.
So I love this. I love this so much. I feel like we had the whole day to talk about this, but I want to thank you so much for your time to join us this morning and drop like both some like good meaty abstract things for us to noodle on, but like also how do we bring it home? How do you try it right now? You can leave the session and go try it right now. So thank you so much, Kyra. If you want to get in touch with her, LinkedIn is her professional avatar. But if you want to like follow her adventures, I definitely encourage you to follow her on Instagram. You're going to get a completely different side. So choose your own adventure, but connect with her if you're interested in doing this work inside your own organizations. And have a great Monday and a great rest of the week, everybody. Practice some of these skills. Just give it a try. And we'll see you next week. Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you.